Guys, I'm having a hard time. I don't understand. This Drakengard 3 is the most frustrating, depraved game I've ever played. And you're telling me that this game was made by Yoko Taro? The guy who wrote and directed Nier and Nier Automata, both of which are definitely in the top 100 games ever made? And I know, don't even start with that whole, but Max, why are you surprised? You played Drakengard 1, which Yoko Taro also wrote and directed, and it wasn't good. Yes, but even if Drakengard 1 wasn't a good game, it was still a really interesting work of art. Much like Spec Ops: The Line, Drakengard made clever use of its lesser elements to comment on how mindless people's enjoyment of violent video games can be. Obviously, it wasn't as good as Spec Ops in that regard, but good enough that I would recommend people muscle through the mind-numbingly repetitive combat just to experience that message. But Drakengard 3? I struggle to formulate coherent sentences because of how much this game drives me nuts. And it's not because the game's terrible, alright? Note that I never said Drakengard 3 is the worst game ever. What I said was that it's the most frustrating game that I've ever played. And that's because the game does feature some high quality and sometimes progressive game design. You know, the type of stuff we've come to expect from Yoko Taro due to the Nier games. But for every genuinely cool thing there is one or two deeply negative elements which overshadow and sometimes outright negate anything positive. And not in a meta way like I said before. This game has straight up some of the worst characters, the most vile dialogue, uninspired level design, and even though I just said that the world building is great, its presentation can sometimes be bafflingly amateurish. So you might be wondering, why even do a video on Drakengard 3? Especially when my channel tries to center around positive vibes. Well, aside from the fact that I promised to do retrospectives on all the Nier and Drakengard games, and yes, I will do one on Drakengard 2, the mere fact of Drakengard 3's existence is fascinating. I have never seen such a union of high positives with low negatives in my entire gaming career. It's like a mangled homunculus that somehow lives despite being made up of vastly different body parts. For that alone, it's worth examination. So, prepare to subject yourself to some of the best and worst that gaming has to offer. This is Drakengard 3.
These necromancers are a bunch of grammars.
The game starts 100 years prior to the first Drakengard game. The opening cutscene tells of 5 sister goddesses known as intoners, descending upon the war-torn land of Midgard. They quell the widespread fighting through the use of their unique magical gift, one based in the power of song. As a result, they are each given pieces of Midgard to rule over, ushering in a new era of peace and prosperity. Despite their overwhelming success, there is a 6th intoner that wishes to murder her 5 sisters, a woman named Zero. Though one might reasonably expect from this setup that Zero would be the main villain, what one might not expect is that Zero is actually the main character that the player controls for the entire game. This immediately causes dissonance, forcing the player to reflect on why Zero, and by extension they, should kill all the good guys. Though Zero outwardly proclaims that she merely wants to steal power from the other 5 intoners so she can have the world all to herself, there are subtle hints that suggest that Zero might have more reasonable motives. It is then up to the player to stomach Zero's murderous rampage, so they might discover what those other motives are. Now I do want to save my analysis of the story for later on, because that's where the majority of this video's focus will be. Instead, I want to start with the gameplay, but before I do that, I must say one quick thing that the game is already messed up. So, Mr. Taro, you're telling me that Drakengard 3 is a prequel, the first in the Drakengard Nier timeline. The main character is named Zero, and it never occurred to you to call the game Drakengard 0? Really? God, that should have been my first hint that Yoko Taro was taking the piss when writing this game. But anyway, before I start my tirade too soon, let's do combat first, something positive. As I made clear in my video on the first Drakengard, I am not a fan of the Musou genre to which that game belongs, where the whole point of the game is to play a hero, quote-unquote, whose strength and skill are so unparalleled that they can mow down hundreds of enemies without suffering a single scratch. Though it shouldn't need to be said, this is in no way me disrespecting those that enjoy that genre. I celebrate that you enjoy it, it's just never really been my thing. I wanted to make my distaste known though, in order to qualify just how vast the improvements to combat are in Drakengard 3. Enough that I found myself feeling genuinely entertained at times. The biggest issue that I felt was fixed was necessitating the use of various weapons. In the first Drakengard, I found that for the majority of the game, the most efficient weapon that I could use was the one that I started out with, and for the most part, I could do without the game's 40 or 50 other weapons. In Drakengard 3, the levels and combat situations vary enough that you are encouraged to switch between the 4 weapon types: swords, spears, combat bracers, and chakrams. If you're confronted with a bunch of shield users, for example, you will want to switch to spears. If you need to deal with a bunch of archers whittling down your health as you try to kill the melee fighters, you will want to use the chakrams first, which function as a ranged weapon, and then maybe switch back to swords or combat bracers. Then there are specific situations where it's not obvious which strategy will work best, and you will want to experiment with weapon combinations on the fly. As somebody who almost always favors light weapons, along with mobility and dexterity in my RPGs, Drakengard 3 not only made me break from that trend, but enjoyed doing so. There are other aspects of combat strategy you will have to consider as well. One are the limited number of health potions and buffs that you will need to learn to use only when absolutely necessary later on. The other is when to use intoner mode, which is probably the coolest thing about this game. As you kill enemies, the red flower icon in the top left corner of your screen will fill up. Anytime this meter is filled, even if it's just partially, you can press L3 and R3 to make Zero go berserk, where she'll deliver lightning-fast melee attacks all while being invincible. Generally speaking, I found that it was best to save in toner mode for boss fights, not just strategically speaking, but also because doing so gave me that feeling I imagine big fans of Musou games get, that feeling of overwhelming power and badassery that gets the testosterone pumping. I never experienced that with a Musou game until I played Drakengard 3, so kudos where it's due. Finally, I want to give some props to the sections where you control your dragon. Whether you're shooting balls of fire from above, or breathing waves of fire on the ground, the dragon sections yield a solid amount of variety and entertainment that the dragon sections in the first game so quickly lost. In other words, they procrastinate those feelings of monotony for a much longer time. But note that I did not say that the monotony is gone completely. Despite the enormous improvements in combat, of which I just said variety was a feature, it still lacks enough variety that I have a hard time recommending it to people who aren't already a fan of the Musou genre. After about 3 or 4 hours, the repetitive mission structure really started to get on my nerves. Aside from the occasional dragon level breaking up the monotony, the gameplay loop goes something like this. You travel forward for about 10 to 15 seconds, then you fight enemies, open a door, fight more enemies, travel another 10 to 15 seconds, fight a boss, and then you end the level. Then you repeat just that for the next 30 hours. There aren't any puzzles, the incentives you get for exploration are mediocre, and even stuff that could be fun, like the 1 or 2 platforming sections that this game has, feel very shoehorned and imprecise, a fact that even the game acknowledges by breaking the 4th wall. Plus, even though some of the dragon sections are cool, I want to qualify that statement by saying that the controls can be very imprecise. Though you can get past them for some sections, there are some levels, particularly when you're indoors or trying to fight a boss, that those imprecise controls drove me nuts. It's like trying to hit the bullseye on a dartboard by throwing the dart with your foot, all the while somebody was moving the dartboard around while having a seizure. Yet despite my personal problems, I can easily see how the combat of this game can appeal to fans of the Musou genre. There are times where it is immensely satisfying, and can maybe even be continuously satisfying all the way up until the end of the game for those who are just looking for some mindless fun. Just one last qualifier I want to mention. I didn't play Drakengard 3 on the original PlayStation 3 hardware. I played it on the RPCS3 emulator with a 60 frames per second patch. Unless you can tolerate a 30 frames per second maximum that will frequently drop into the 10s, including the low 10s when you're flying on the Dragon, I would strongly recommend emulation. So, while I would generally give gameplay a positive mark in Drakengard 3, it does come with a lot of caveats. However, if there is one thing about Drakengard 3 that I can say is straight up fantastic, no questions asked, obviously it's the music. Is it as good as the earworm-inducing music in the Nier games? No, but it comes ridiculously close. The lead composer, Keiichi Okabe, this guy is becoming the modern-day Nobuo Uematsu for me. Every song he produces is borderline immaculate, bearing a dynamic personality of its own while merging effortlessly with the personality of the story and the gameplay. Whether it's the pulsating electronica and guitar distortion of the boss battles, the piano ballads featured in the game's menu, and the story's quieter moments, they all provide a rich texture to each moment in Drakengard, one that most forms of media would kill for. Well, I hope you enjoyed your usual level-headed analysis from your favorite monotoned autist. Because now is the point where I use every fiber of my being to avoid doing the opposite. To avoid the levels of anger that, let's say, a Nier character has when they have a minor existential crisis. So, let's talk about the story. I have a fan theory. One that, even if it isn't true, will summarize why I'm so upset with this story. When Drakengard 2 came out, fan reception was split. Though some liked it, there were some that felt it deviated too much from what made the first game stand out from other RPGs. Namely, the extremely dark, nihilistic world and degenerate characters. One might reasonably theorize that this might have resulted from Yoko Taro's lack of involvement with Drakengard 2, neither writing nor directing the project. I suspect that when Yoko Taro was brought back for the third installment, he wanted to placate the fans that wanted a return to form. So, he sat down in front of his typewriter, cracked his knuckles, and said out loud, "You want Dark and Depraved? I will give you Dark and Depraved." Like I said, there is no evidence for this theory of mine, but it would explain a lot. Of course, it's not like Drakengard 1 wasn't dark and depraved, but the key difference between it and Drakengard 3 is that the depravity was very slowly revealed over the course of many hours, in ways that paralleled the increasing blandness and monotony of the gameplay. The whole point was to try and instigate reflection in the gamer, to make them ask themselves, why am I playing this? Am I getting any enjoyment out of it? If the answer is yes, you had better justify to yourself why that is in a game that features the main characters delighting in the death and exploitation of children. In short, Drakengard 1 lures you into that trap where you need to self-reflect. In Drakengard 3, there is not a slow buildup of darkness and depravity. Rather, it is maximized from beginning to end. Though there are a few moments where that dreadful content is used in a way that reflects the first game's original intent, they are tragically outnumbered by moments where it just feels excessive and pointless. And not even in a way where the point is that it's pointless. It's just pointless. How bad does it get? I will give you a very precise answer. Bear with me as I set things up. So, as everybody who has ever played a Yoko Taro game knows, you are going to get multiple endings. The same is true for Drakengard 3. but with one major exception. Alongside the multiple endings are multiple story branches. I will get into the exact mechanics of this in a minute, but for now, just think of the branches as ways that the story could have gone, like a parallel timeline. Half of the game is Branch A, while branches B, C, and D comprise the other half. Admittedly, branches B through D do introduce some of that genuinely great Yoko Taro narrative flavor. But until then, you have to suffer through 8 to 10 hours of some of the most vile, repulsive dialogue and characterization that I've ever seen in a video game. Let's start with the side characters. As Zero goes on her quest to kill the other intoners, she comes across 4 people who join her at various points on her journey. These characters are Dido, Decadus, Octa, and Scent. With the exception of Scent, who I found somewhat entertaining despite being despicable, the other 3 are, without exaggeration, in my top 5 most hated characters from any video game ever. Why are Dido, Decadus, and Octa the worst? It's because their only purpose is to make a joke every second or third sentence that comes out of their face hole.
I need 72 straight hours of self-pleasure before I'm ready for combat.
I wouldn't broach that subject, or she might turn your balls into pudding. Ooh. The way my blade split those ridiculous fun bags clean in two, it was like fine art.
I'm neither joking nor exaggerating when I say that about a quarter or a third of the dialogue in this game is just sex jokes. There are more sex jokes in this game than in a 2-hour SpongeBob YouTube poop compilation. And almost all the jokes are supplied by these 3 jerk-offs.
And then afterwards, a good clear some sand from the lion's den.
Crime upon crime piles up on our ledger.
Are you getting off on this?
You guys know the movie Inside Out, where the main characters are the personifications of a young girl's emotions? Imagine that, but the movie was about Howard Stern, and his emotions were the characters from Drakengard 3. That's what they're like. Now, let's make a few things clear real quick. First, I have zero problem with sexual humor. Moreover, I think there are a lot of ways that this kind of depravity could fit perfectly into the world of Drakengard. The problem is that the humor seems to be used for virtually no purpose other than to be excessive.
Doctors say a passionate night of log jamming is the perfect cure for such ailments,
It's as if Yoko Taro were a 10-year-old boy who just learned what a "that's what she said" joke was. Then he cast his face towards the horizon and said to himself with utmost conviction, "Now I know what I must do." Second, yes, I am perfectly aware that there is a lore reason for the horniness, but it is simply not enough to justify the excess. Saying the lore reason justifies 300 sex jokes is like saying, well, Valve hasn't made Half-Life 3 in 20 years, let's all collectively make voodoo dolls of Gabe Newell and poke them until we get what we want. Which, well... Wait, no, stop that, Max! And this is mostly all the game is for the first half. An 8-hour-long Lenny Bruce special where Zero kills her sisters. And even though, I will admit, there are a few moments of clever writing here and there, like the fourth wall breaks, for example, their quality is mostly tarnished by the muck that surrounds them. But then, Branch A ends, and we finally start to get that Yoko Taro flavor that we know and love. Returning to the concept of the branches, in each timeline, an event of such significance will happen that a new timeline will branch off from it, a singularity event if you will. After ending A, we go back in the timeline to one of those singularity events, which then creates a separate branch, continuing the previous story but in a different way. Though the branches are technically unrelated to one another, the events in each timeline ultimately get tied together into one cohesive story at the end. To those who have not played Drakengard 3, this narrative approach might sound overly complicated, but it's really not, thanks to one character who is conscious of these timelines. Her name is Accord. If I were to describe Accord in a single sentence, I would say she's like G-Man from the aforementioned Half-Life, except if she were an anime waifu. Like G-Man, her job is to observe and record the activity of special individuals. In this case, that person is Zero, who she observes to make sure that her unique abilities can be controlled and not result in a rupture of the space-time continuum. She does this for her mysterious employers, but just like with G-Man's employers, their identity is a complete mystery. Nonetheless, the introduction of a G-Man-like character with Accord and her observation of multiple timelines results in a story structure that feels highly original and creative. On top of that, it expands the Drakengard/Nier universe and sets the franchise up to go in really interesting directions. Like I said, this is the type of stuff that I crave from Yoko Taro's games, and though I had to stomach Branch A to get it, I felt it paid off in the end. Now speaking of payoffs, there is the question of Zero's motivations, the reasons for her murderous rampage. Is it explained in a satisfying way? Yes? Kind of? Look, in and of itself, Zero's true motivations make sense, sure. Moreover, I would say that the revelation of her true intent effectively continues the main theme of the first Nier game, which is to avoid making snap judgments whenever possible. But while the payoff is fine and works thematically, the problem is that it doesn't justify the 30 hours of monotony and grossness when you can get the same thing in multiple and far superior forms with Nier. Plus, unlike the revelations from Nier that flip our perceptions of people on a dime, I can't say that I felt the same for Zero. I still feel that she's kind of reprehensible. Now, of course, I can already hear people say, but what about the supplementary material? Like the prequel book, the stuff that goes into Zero's past and how she became the person she is. True, that is a good argument. In the prequel novella for the game, we learn about how Zero became the murderous, nihilistic savage she is now. The book is actually pretty good, by the way. Not only does it feature more well-written dialogue than anything in the game, it does a lot to make Zero more three-dimensional and understandable. The only problem is that none of that is in the game! I should not have to read a book to make the story in the game better. That story should be in the game. And anybody who disagrees, I got one word for you. Destiny. No, scratch that. I should say 3 words, Final Fantasy 15, because like that game, Drakengard 3 sells extra bits of the story, including more background on Zero, through DLC, when it should have been in the main game from the beginning. Anyway, I respect that there are people who disagree with me about this game. I'm fully aware that there are Yoko Taro fans who honestly proclaim Drakengard 3 to be their favorite in the series, citing the fact that it's so unique and hard to categorize. And like I said, I genuinely celebrate that. Like, that's the whole beauty of art, right? It's all subjective. However, there is one aspect of Drakengard 3 that I have yet to hear anybody, fan or non-fan, defend. I am of course talking about the rhythm game in Ending D. Now let me be clear, I'm not talking about the music, the framing, or the meaning of Ending D. That's all beautiful. Plus, it's not like the mechanics of the rhythm game are difficult in and of themselves. It's the fact that if you make one mistake over the span of this 8-minute long sequence, you have to start all over again. Not only that, you have to endure the same non-skippable opening cutscene to the rhythm game every time you fail. That alone makes Ending D of Drakengard 3 the most tedious form of game design that I have ever had to endure. To all my fellow Dark Souls fans, I would rather run through Lost Izalith to the bed of chaos 50 times than have to endure Ending D ever again. No, really, it's that bad. To quote fellow YouTuber Nero the Sky, who did a fantastic 47-minute breakdown of this nightmare by the way, Ending D is a meta joke at the player's expense. So, yeah, Drakengard 3. I didn't like it. But I don't think it's at all unreasonable for other people to say that they do. Like I just said at the beginning, the mere fact that a game like Drakengard 3 exists is fascinating. I can see how its vast idiosyncrasies could charm people enough to overlook its various flaws, an effort that is made easier by some solid combat, amazing music, and some progressive storytelling ideas. Unfortunately, the issues that I have are enough to dissuade me from ever playing Drakengard 3 again. Thankfully though, as a massive fan of the Nier games and the overall Draken Nier universe, I got enough positive from Drakengard 3 that I don't regret my time with it, and I'm sure that positive sentiment will only increase when the story ideas that the game introduced pay off in future installments. But what did you guys think of Drakengard 3? Let me know in the comment section below. Make sure to hit the like button if you liked this video, that helps me out a lot. Finally, if you want to see my other videos on the Drakengard and Nier games, click on any of the videos you see on screen now. Until next time, remember to stay safe and stay yellow.